Hello, and welcome to this episode of Contemporary Issues Across Latin America. I'm your host, Isabella, and today we'll be putting a spotlight on Venezuela and its judicial system. Before we begin, consider this. Do you think that a free and fair judicial system is fundamental for upholding democracy? Findings published by the United Nations in 2019 found that respecting and guaranteeing the independence and impartiality of justice is an essential pillar for protecting human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Venezuela is currently experiencing a lack of independence in its judicial system. Throughout this episode, we'll examine the causes and consequences of this lack of judicial independence, and what steps are being taken to restore freedom and fairness in Venezuela's justice system. Before we go any further, let's start with some background on the situation. In Venezuela, the judiciary has lost its independence from the executive branch of government, severely damaging the country's democracy. The executive branch, in this case the president, has put measures in place to control the judicial branch, which should be functioning independently of presidential influence. Since the election of former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez in 1998, and through the legacy of his successor and current president Nicolas Maduro, the country's government has transitioned into an authoritarian regime. Presidents Chavez and Maduro have taken steps to limit the independence of the courts through many means. Their main method of doing so was by packing judges. They have raised the number of justices on the bench in Venezuela's Supreme Court from 20 to 32. Shortly after the re-election of Nicolas Maduro in 2015, there were no positions open on the Supreme Court. However, 13 new justices were appointed, while 13 sitting justices decided to voluntarily resign. They have also reduced the permanency of an appointment to the Supreme Tribunal of Justice. In doing so, justices have to be more mindful of their rulings to maintain their position. Law passed in 2002 gave the president's power to both pack and purge the courts. This gave the executive the ability to pack the courts with government-favoring justices and purge the courts of those that have ruled against the position of the government. This allows the president the legal authority to further their agendas by simply changing laws and statutes to meet their needs. An analysis of 45,000 court cases with connection to Venezuela's executive branch between 2004 and 2013 show that the court never once made a ruling that went against the executive. Reports from the UN's fact-finding mission in Venezuela have found that the country's justice system has led to the violation of human rights across the country. Examples in the report highlight corrupt rulings made by courts with connection to the executive branch. In 2021, a detective was sentenced to 5 years and 10 months in prison for pleading guilty to negligent homicide, among other charges. Then, in February 2022, the sentence was reduced by a higher court to only 2 years and 8 months. There have also been several reports of death while in police custody, and many individuals remaining in detention for over 3 years without trial, which is a violation of both old and newly reformed law in the country. The report stated that reforms to the justice system proposed by the National Assembly in the summer of 2021 would not be enough or sufficient to negate the effects of the lack of judicial independence without proper implementation. As we explore this issue, our first focus question will be surrounding the causes of the lack of an independent judicial system. How has U.S. interventionism in Venezuela contributed to the reduction of the separation of powers and judicial independence? The roots of this issue can be linked to Venezuela's foreign interference and dependency. Venezuela can be classified as a petrostate, which means that its government is heavily reliant on the income from the export of fossil fuels. Venezuela is home to the largest oil reserves in the world, discovered in 1922. With about 98% of the Venezuelan oil market owned by a handful of foreign companies, a law passed in 1943 saw foreign companies required to give 50% of their profits to the government. Oil production was booming in the country until the 1980s, when the price of oil took a hit, leading to economic turmoil. This made way for the rise of Hugo Chavez, who appealed to the working class with his promises to combat poverty and increase social programs. The United States has a long history of intervening in the affairs of Latin American countries. During the Cold War, the US was focused on limiting the spread of communism and ensuring that none of its neighboring countries started to align themselves with the USSR. To do so, the United States started to offer financing and investment into the economy and militaries of countries who ideologically aligned with the US. The main target for the US was training military personnel and influencing youth. By the 1960s, Venezuela received the most U.S. assistance of any country in Latin America. They received over $500 million in financing for military education programs between 1962 and 1963. The objective of these programs was to influence and spread anti-communist rhetoric among military personnel at a time when military coups were happening very frequently. The focus on youth in Venezuela shared a similar rationale. The minds of youth are very moldable, so the U.S. feared they would be most at risk to the influence of pro-communist ideas and developing an anti-U.S. sentiment. To avoid this situation, the U.S. created new programs for cultural diplomacy. New scholarships and modernization of Venezuelan curriculum took place with the help of American universities and the training of youth group leaders to share a look into American student life and democracy. In addition, the U.S. expanded its broadcasting. It also distributed books and movies into Venezuela as another way to spread the word about American values such as democracy. Once the Cold War period ended in the 1990s, the U.S. shifted its focus. With the influence of Soviet ideas now being a larger threat to former USSR countries, the U.S. transitioned their focus to Eastern Europe and started to downsize their programs in Venezuela and across Latin America. The new aim for U.S. diplomacy in the country was to continue assisting the promotion of democracy and potential political transitions. Venezuela was considered a prime candidate for having open and fair elections. At this time, Hugo Chavez was gaining in popularity, which led to U.S. organizations engaging with potential alternative candidates to the presidency and members of the National Assembly and military. This has been considered the foundation for future U.S. campaigns to train prospective candidates to become what the U.S. would consider an ideal leader. President Chavez was then able to use his popularity to expand the controls of the executive branch, leading to the demise of a separation of powers. Now that we've addressed the factors that led to Venezuela's judiciary losing its independence, our next question looks at the consequences of these actions. How has the lack of a separation of powers and an executive-controlled judicial system impacted the people of Venezuela? The consequences of not having a functional judicial system are widespread. Without the rule of law, there is no accountability, which severely limits democracy. How is the government acting on behalf of the people when there is no system to keep them accountable to the people? Many human rights violations have taken place at the hands of the government. There is record of government pressuring law enforcement and court officials to cover up many forms of abuses. In the United Nations Independent Fact-Finding Mission in Venezuela, it cited evidence of unlawful executions, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, and torture in the country since 2014. Judges and prosecutors have been found keeping individuals in custody even when there has been no evidence to support claims of criminal acts. The report from the mission also found that the mass protests in opposition of the government have been met with an increasingly violent response, and that state intelligence agencies have engaged in politically motivated detention and torture. Investigations have found that in almost all cases of unlawful killings by security forces in Venezuela, there have been no prosecution for those responsible. Fighting for justice is extremely difficult in Venezuela, and that only gets exacerbated for women with cases of gender-based violence. In 2001, Linda Loaiza Lopez Soto was kidnapped and a victim of gender-based violence. After she was rescued, she faced a justice system with inadequate support and knowledge on gender-based violence. The executive-controlled judicial branch was more focused on protecting her perpetrator, since he was related to an important and prominent figure in the country. The justice system had a difficult time coming to a decision on the case, and the defendant was only subject to 6 years and 1 month in prison for his violent crimes against Linda. This failure to bring justice only highlights the corruption and inadequacies of this executive-controlled justice system. Another significant consequence of having a lack of separation of powers between the judicial and executive branch is the role courts play in suppressing political opponents. Forced disappearances have been used by Presidents Chavez and Maduro to instill fear in their rivals. The New York Times highlights the case of Gilbert Carroll, described as a charismatic lawmaker who has been put in jail 3 times by security forces since 2017. Cases cited in the UN fact-finding mission also find that individuals who have expressed opposition to the current government and its policy have had suspicious deaths. The report states Fernando Albin was an opposition leader who fell to his death from the 10th floor while detained in the Bolivian National Intelligence Service headquarters. Rafael Acosta Arevalo was a military officer who fainted and died in a Caracas courtroom following torture in 2018. And Juan Pablo Pernolet was a student who died after a tear gas canister struck his chest at close range during a protest in Caracas in 2017. With the courts in the pocket of the president, he is able to commit acts of violating international human rights without consequence. Without a free judicial system, there is no way to seek justice in Venezuela. While Venezuela currently experiences injustice without an independent judicial system, individuals and actors, both domestically and internationally, are working to restore justice and freedom to the country. Our next focus question is how are actors from around the world working to restore judicial independence and justice in Venezuela? Looking forward to the future vision for Venezuela, Juan Guaido is at the forefront. He is currently the leader of the opposition and was believed to be the winner of the 2019 presidential election. While he was recognized by many states around the world, President Maduro did not accept these results and ultimately retained control. Guaido has announced a plan organized in conjunction with the National Assembly to restore Venezuela following the exit of Maduro from government. Plan PAI consists of 3 main components for the future vision of the country. The first being the restoration of the country's democracy with free and fair elections. Secondly, introducing economic reform to benefit individuals, and finally, to reform many of the necessary social programs, such as healthcare and education. When Plan PAI was discussed at the Atlantic Council in 2019, Carlos Vecchio, the Venezuelan ambassador to the United States, appointed by Juan Guaido, along with many other political and corporate representatives, were calling for the reconstruction of Venezuela and its institutions. Ambassador Carlos Vecchio also called it morally imperative that international organizations continue to invest in the rebuilding of the country. These figures are not the only actors calling for action in Venezuela. The International Bar Association and the International Commission of Jurists have also called out and criticized the judicial system in Venezuela for not being independent. They have raised their concern alongside other organizations with the United Nations Human Rights Committee that the current court system is enabling the governments to commit human rights abuses. The Inter-American courts have also gotten involved. The case of Linda Loaiza Lopez Soto was the first case of its kind to be brought to this international court. Any ruling could be precedent-setting to allow women who are victims of gender-based violence in Venezuela and throughout Latin America to seek justice outside their home country. Throughout this episode, we have worked through the causes and consequences of Venezuela's lack of judicial independence. Going forward, many individuals are working towards restoring the country, its institutions, and justice system, which is the first step towards combating the human rights injustices committed by the current government. Thank you for joining us today, and until our next episode, stay well.